I have been sitting on this story for a long time. My name is Quinley, I am 32 years old. I grew up in a house where one daughter was celebrated and the other was tolerated, and earlier this year I sold my company for $21 million while my family had no idea it even existed. Then came Thanksgiving, and everything came out at once. Before I get into all of it, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. And if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button because this one is for you. Subscribe if you are new here because the rest of this story is something you do not want to walk into halfway through. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I was 9 years old the first time I understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that I was not the one they were watching. I had spent 3 days working on a drawing. I remember every detail of that piece, the colors I mixed, the way I layered the paper, the amount of time I put into it. I set it on the kitchen table where my mother would see it when she came in from work. She walked past it, looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, said, "That's nice, honey," and kept moving. That same afternoon, my older sister Rosalind came home with a spelling bee certificate. My mother called my father at work. She called my grandmother. She put the certificate on the refrigerator with 2 magnets and made Rosalind's favorite dinner that night. I did not cry about it, I was 9, I just noticed. Rosalind was 2 years older than me, and she occupied every room she walked into. Not in a mean way, she was genuinely funny, genuinely confident, and she knew exactly how to talk to adults. She played soccer, she did debate, she brought home the kind of results that parents could point to at dinner parties. My father, Gerald, was a man who showed his feelings through his actions more than his words, and his actions were a clear record. He coached Rosalind's soccer team for 3 seasons. He drove 3 hours round trip to watch her compete in a regional debate tournament. He framed her school photos and put them in the living room. He never came to a single art show I was part of. Not one, and there were several, including 2 that were held less than 20 minutes from our house. My mother, Diane, was not a cold person. She was warm, she was present, she was a good mother in many ways. But she directed her energy toward the loudest signal, and Rosalind was always the loudest signal. My accomplishments were quieter. A piece selected for a regional youth art exhibition, a design published in the school magazine. Diane would acknowledge these things and then move on. The acknowledgement lasted about as long as a nod. There was a shelf in our living room that I thought of as Rosalind's shelf. Debate trophies, sports medals, a small framed clipping from a local paper about the debate tournament. My work was in my room, occasionally on the refrigerator for a week before something replaced it. One Christmas I asked for a professional drawing tablet. I had done research, I knew the exact model I wanted and why. I got socks and a gift card to a clothing store. Rosalind got a laptop. By the time I was 14, I had stopped bringing my work to my parents for a reaction. Not because I was angry at them. I stopped because I needed to protect something in myself that kept getting smaller every time I hoped and was disappointed. My interior life became completely my own. I built walls around it, not to keep people out, but to keep what was inside from being minimized again. I want to be honest about Rosalind here. She was not cruel to me when we were growing up. She did not actively make my life harder. She was simply a person who had been handed a role from the time she was small, and she filled it completely. She did not see my situation because she had never had a reason to look. That does not make it okay, it just makes it real. The summer after my high school graduation, Rosalind received a full scholarship to a private university 4 states away. My parents threw her a graduation party with 30 people, catered food, a banner across the front of the house. When I graduated the following year with solid grades and a partial scholarship to a state school, we went to dinner at a local restaurant, just the 4 of us. Gerald spent part of the meal checking his phone. Diane talked about Rosalind's upcoming first semester. I sat across from my father that night and I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. No speech, no moment, no declaration. I just decided, quietly and completely, that I was going to build something on my own, and that I was going to do it without waiting for anyone in that family to believe in it first. I arrived at a mid-sized state university in the Pacific Northwest with a second-hand laptop, a small scholarship, and a portfolio I had built entirely by myself over the previous 4 years. I enrolled in the graphic design program and walked into my first studio class and felt, for the first time in my life, that I was in a room where my work was the only thing that mattered. Nobody there knew me as the quieter sister. Nobody had a shelf to compare me to. I was just Quinley, and my work either held up or it did not. It held up. In my second semester, I took an elective on digital media and brand communication taught by a professor named Harriet Voss. She was in her late 50s, had spent 2 decades in professional advertising before moving into academia, and she had a way of looking at student work that was completely direct. She did not perform enthusiasm. When she liked something, she said so plainly, and you understood immediately that the plainness was the point. She looked at my project in the 3rd week of class, a brand identity system I had built for a fictional outdoor equipment company, and she said, "This is exceptional. Not technically you still have things to learn, but conceptually, you understand how to move people with structure, and most designers spend their entire careers trying to get there." Then she moved on to the next student. I sat in my car after that class for a long time. I was not upset. I was the opposite of upset. I was processing the experience of being seen clearly by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from saying it. I started taking on freelance work at 20. Small clients at first, local restaurants needing menu redesigns, a few small business owners needing logos, a startup founder who needed a pitch deck built fast and built well. I charged modest rates, learned from every project, and put every dollar I made back into better software and equipment. I also started teaching myself video editing in the evenings, because I could see that the market for designers who could also handle motion work was growing quickly. And I wanted to be positioned for that. At 22, in the final semester of my undergraduate program, I registered an LLC with $200 in my bank account. I named it Draxen Solutions. The name came from a notepad, from a night when I was writing down ideas, and that word appeared and stayed. The company offered graphic design, brand identity development, and video editing services, targeting technology and media companies specifically. My first client was a local software startup that needed a full brand overhaul before a product launch. I charged them $3,000. They later told me the work helped them secure their seed funding round. The early years were not pretty. I worked from my apartment. I skipped social events more times than I can count. I ate cheap, slept erratically, and ran every decision through a mental calculation of whether it would help the business survive another quarter. My closest friend during this period was a woman named Petra, who had studied communications at the same university and occasionally helped me with client-facing writing. Petra was the person I called when things went wrong, and there was a season when things went wrong frequently. My contact with my family during this time was surface level. I called home occasionally. I showed up for holidays when I could manage the travel. My parents knew I had a design business. My father had never asked its name. Rosalind, who by this point had married a man named Magnus and settled into a comfortable life in a suburb 2 hours from our parents, had once made a comment about how design was a risky field with no real ceiling. I did not correct her. I did not volunteer information. I simply kept building. By the time I turned 25, Draxen Solutions had 12 regular clients and 2 part-time contractors working under me. I was not wealthy, but what I had built was solid. Every piece of it had been constructed without anyone in my family knowing it existed, without anyone's encouragement, and without anyone's approval. And that meant it was entirely mine. When I was 26, a former contractor named Derek filed a legal dispute against me claiming partial ownership of Draxen Solutions. Derek had worked with me on 2 projects over a 6-month period, and he alleged that a verbal agreement had been made between us during that time that entitled him to an ownership stake in the company. There was no written record of any such agreement because no such agreement had ever been made. The dispute still cost me $40,000 in attorney fees and 6 months of the worst stress I had experienced in my adult life. I did not sleep well for weeks. I lost weight. I second-guessed every decision I had ever made about who I brought into my work. There were nights when I sat at my desk and genuinely considered whether the whole thing was worth it. I kept going because the alternative was letting Derek's claim stand, and I was not capable of doing that. The case was resolved entirely in my favor. Derek's claim was found to have no legal standing, but the outcome taught me something permanent about how I needed to run my business. I hired a business attorney named Colette, rewrote every contractor agreement from scratch, put ironclad scope of work documentation in place for every client engagement, and came out of that crisis with a company that was legally and structurally far more professional than it had been going in. At 27, through a referral from a previous client, I was introduced to the marketing director of a mid-sized technology company called Novran Group. Novaren provided data management software to healthcare organizations and needed two things simultaneously: a complete visual rebrand and a series of 30 product explainer videos to support a major platform launch. The contract, after 2 weeks of negotiation, came to $420,000 across 18 months. I remember reading the final signed contract at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning. I sat completely still for a long time afterward. The Novaren contract gave me the financial foundation to scale properly. I brought on 4 full-time employees, 2 designers, 1 video editor, and a project manager named Terence, who turned out to be one of the most capable people I had ever worked with. I moved Draxen Solutions out of my apartment and into a small commercial office space. Over the next 3 years, the team grew to 18 full-time staff, and our client roster expanded to include 6 companies across the technology and healthcare sectors. When I was 30, I was approached by a representative from a company called Rosalind Systems, a mid-sized technology firm that had been expanding its internal creative capabilities by acquiring outside studios rather than building from scratch. Rosalind had hired Draxen Solutions as an outside vendor on 2 projects. They wanted the whole operation, the team, the client relationships, the proprietary workflow systems we had developed, all of it. The initial conversation was casual. The formal acquisition offer came 8 months later, after a detailed valuation process conducted by both sides. Rosalind offered $21 million for full acquisition of Draxen Solutions. I consulted Colette, my financial advisor Bernard, and Petra. I negotiated the terms over 3 months. I secured retention agreements for my core team and made sure that Terence and several other long-term employees received meaningful bonuses from the proceeds. I signed the acquisition agreement on a Tuesday morning in March. I went home, made coffee, and called Petra. Neither of us said much for a while. My family knew nothing, not because I had deliberately concealed it, because no one had ever asked about my work in enough detail to stumble into it. My mother knew I had a design company. My father had never once asked its name. Rosalind had made her comment about the field years ago, and I had not updated her since. The acquisition was noted in a business trade publication. It did not make mainstream news. It happened quietly, and I let it stay that way. That year, Thanksgiving was hosted at Rosalind and Magnus's house. The guest list included Gerald and Diane, me, Petra as my guest, Magnus's colleague from work named Fletcher and his wife Donna, and 2 neighbors of Rosalind's named Ted and Ren. Rosalind had spent visible effort on the meal and the setup, and she moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had been hosting this kind of event her whole life. I arrived early and helped set food out. The familiar low-grade tension of being in a room where I was perpetually the secondary presence settled in immediately, and I let it. I was used to it. I knew how to exist in that space without letting it touch anything important. The first part of the meal was routine. Gerald talked about a home renovation he was considering. Diane mentioned something from her church community. Rosalind spent a substantial portion of the early conversation showing Ted and Ren photos of a kitchen renovation she and Magnus were planning, taking in their compliments with practiced ease. I ate, contributed when asked a direct question, and did not push for space in the conversation. Magnus had been briefly on his phone sometime between the main course and dessert. He put it down, looked across the table at Fletcher, and said he had just seen something interesting in a trade newsletter he followed for work. Magnus said there was a creative services acquisition that had caught his attention, a company called Draxen Solutions, acquired by a technology firm called Rosalind Systems for $21 million. He said it as a conversation point, casually, the way people in corporate finance mention deals they find notable. Then he said, "Anyone heard of them?" I set my fork down. Petra, sitting 2 seats away from me, went very still. I did not look at her, I looked at Magnus. Magnus looked back at me. I watched him connect the pieces in real time right there at the table. His expression shifted. He said, "Wait," a pause, then, "Draxen Solutions, that is your company, is it not?" I told him yes, quietly without any particular emphasis. Yes, that was my company. I had sold it earlier that year. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Gerald set his fork down. Diane put her hand over her mouth. Ted and Ren looked between the people at the table with the careful attention of guests who sense that something significant is happening that they do not fully understand. Fletcher leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine professional interest and asked a question about the structure of the deal. Rosalind did not respond for almost 30 seconds. Then she laughed. It was a short sound, sharp, and it did not match her face at all. She said, $21 million. She repeated it as if it were a number that could not possibly be accurate. Then she looked directly at me and said, "And you never said anything, not once." Her tone was not hurt. It had an edge of outrage in it, as if I had committed some kind of offense by not broadcasting my progress to a family that had spent 20 years not asking about it. What came after was not a single explosion, it was a sequence. Rosalind began making statements framed as questions, then stopped framing them as questions at all. She said, "So this whole time you have been sitting here letting us think you were just getting by," she said. "You could have said something, you could have told the family." Gerald opened his mouth and stopped. Diane looked at the table. I did not raise my voice. I said, "No one ever asked." That sentence landed in a way I had not fully anticipated. Wren set her napkin down. Fletcher looked at his glass. Ted said carefully that perhaps this was a conversation better suited for a private moment. Rosalind turned and said something dismissive to him. Magnus placed his hand on her arm and she pulled away from it. Fletcher said something diplomatic about the professional achievement being remarkable. Rosalind said, "Of course it is remarkable, but that is not the point." Nobody asked her what the point was. It was visible to everyone at that table. She was not angry that I had built something extraordinary. She was angry that the order of things, the order she had occupied without question her entire life, had shifted in a direction she had not been informed of and had no control over. The gathering ended before 9 that evening. The guests left with careful, polite goodbyes. Magnus stayed in the kitchen. Rosalind had gone upstairs. I helped Diane carry dishes and neither of us spoke much. Gerald sat in the living room and did not move. Petra and I drove to the hotel where we were staying for the weekend and she asked if I was okay. I told her yes, and I mostly was. At 11:40 that night, a long text message arrived from Rosalind. It opened with an apology, brief and perfunctory. Then it pivoted. She wrote that I had always kept the family at a distance, that my secrecy had made everyone feel like outsiders in my life. Then she made her actual point. She and Magnus had been looking at a property investment for some time, and with my financial position, it represented a real family opportunity. She described it as something we could do together. I read the message twice. I put my phone face down and went to sleep. At 8:15 the next morning, there was a knock at the hotel room door. I opened it to find Gerald standing in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee from the lobby downstairs. He asked if he could come in. He sat in the chair near the window and did not speak for close to a minute. Then he said, "I have not been fair to you." He said it simply. No setup, no qualification. He continued. He had spent 30 years equating visible achievement with real potential and loudness with direction, and he had looked past what was directly in front of him because it did not fit the pattern he recognized. He named specific things: the art shows, the graduation dinner, the years of not asking about my work. His voice was unsteady, though he did not break. He told me he was not asking for immediate forgiveness and understood he had no right to expect it. He said he wanted the chance to be different going forward. I listened to all of it. Then I told him the truth. I was not angry at him in the way he might expect. I had done most of that processing years ago. But I told him that being passed over consistently had shaped me in ways that took a long time to understand, that I had spent years building in silence because silence felt safer than reaching toward recognition that did not come. I told him that the company, the work, all of it had been built in the absence of any support from my family, not in spite of them, but simply without them, and that had been necessary. Gerald listened without interrupting. Later that afternoon, Diane called. She did not have a prepared statement. She told me she had spoken with Gerald. She said, "I did not see you the way I should have, I am sorry." The simplicity of it was more meaningful than anything elaborate would have been. I told her I appreciated it. I meant that. Rosalind called once that weekend. The conversation began with a softer version of the apology from her text, and then moved again back toward the property investment. It was now framed as a family venture. I told her I would think about it. I had no intention of doing so. In the weeks that followed, 2 more messages arrived from her on the same subject. I responded briefly and politely each time. I did not invest. I did not lend money. I did not explain my reasoning beyond what was necessary. The relationship between Rosalind and me did not end in a single defined moment after Thanksgiving. It contracted to its actual size, which turned out to be considerably smaller than the version we had both been performing for years. We exchanged messages on birthdays. We were both at the Christmas gathering that year and it was civil and quiet. The pretense of closeness that had existed at every family event for as long as I could remember was no longer being maintained, and what remained in its place was more honest, if significantly colder. I did not change my life dramatically after the acquisition. I bought a house, a modest one, with a large spare room I converted into a proper studio. I travelled twice, both times to places I had wanted to see for years. I continued consulting work with Elindor Systems under the terms of the acquisition agreement and found the work genuinely satisfying. I invested consistently with Bernard's guidance and kept my financial decisions careful and deliberate. 8 months after the sale closed, I established a scholarship fund through my state university's art and design department. It was designated specifically for first-generation college students pursuing creative fields, students who, as I put it to the program director, often brought the most original thinking and had the least structural support behind them. I named it the Voss Fund, after Professor Harriet Voss. When I told Harriet about it, she went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not have to do that." I told her I knew that. Over the following year, I made deliberate effort with my parents, not to reconstruct something that had never fully existed, but to build something new on more honest terms. I called more regularly. I visited twice. Gerald came to my studio once and walked through it slowly, looking at the work displayed on the walls. He did not say a great deal. He did not need to. Diane sent me a card on the anniversary of Draxen Solutions, founding. She had found the date somewhere, and inside it she wrote, "I am proud of you. I should have said it much sooner." I kept that card. Regarding Rosalind, in the year following Thanksgiving, Magnus's firm went through an internal restructuring, and he was placed into a significantly lower compensation position. The property investment Rosalind had been pursuing fell through when the financing arrangement did not hold together. I learned about both things through Diane, not directly from Rosalind. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard it. I felt something closer to recognition, that a life built primarily on surfaces requires constant upkeep, and that the maintenance of those surfaces was not something I had ever been responsible for. What I carry forward from all of this is not a sense of victory. I do not think of myself as someone who won. I think of myself as someone who kept working when there was no audience, no applause, no one paying attention, and that consistency over many years produced something real. The $21 million was a result. The actual thing I am most proud of is the decade that preceded it, the freelance clients in my apartment, the legal crisis I survived, the contract I signed at 2 a.m, the team I built and protected when I sold. Being overlooked for a long time is painful. I am not going to tell you otherwise, but it also strips away a particular kind of noise, the noise of other people's expectations, other people's definitions of what you should be and when you should arrive. When that noise is absent, you are left with your own judgment. Some people cannot function without external confirmation. I learned to function without it entirely. And that turned out to be the most valuable thing my family ever gave me, even though they gave it by accident. I am 32 years old. I am exactly where I chose to be, and I did not need anyone's shelf to get here. Now I want to hear from you. If you have ever been the one in your family who was overlooked, the one whose work was passed over, the one who built something real while everyone else was looking in a different direction, tell me about it in the comments. What did you build? What kept you going when nobody was watching? I read every single comment and I want to know your story. If this video stayed with you, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. Subscribe if you are not already here, because every story on this channel is built on something real. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share this video with them. Sometimes the right story at the right moment changes the direction of someone's day, or more than that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way through. Whatever you are building right now, in whatever silence you are building it in, keep going. The right people will see it. And even if they never do, you will know what you made. That is enough. That has always been enough.